Hi, I'm Bob Gimlin, and this video is about 3 separate animal attacks, each resulting in a fatality, and it's a reminder of the risk we take when we enter a domain that is not our own. The first one took place on July 22nd, 2003, in the Antarctic waters of South Cove, off Adelaide Island, which is south of South America. Kirsty Brown was one of 4 researchers stationed at the United Kingdom's REUPLOAD research station. They were studying the effects of iceberg scouring on marine habitats. 2 researchers were on shore with an inflatable boat, while Kirsty and another researcher swam to a buoy that marked the location of underwater equipment that needed to be checked. Kirsty and her colleague were wearing dry suits and equipped with snorkeling gear, not scuba, snorkeling. When the swimmers got about 80 feet from shore, a large, dark shape left some rocks and headed toward Kirsty. It moved just beneath the surface of the water. According to an account from one of the researchers on shore, Kirsty was not alarmed by this, as the shadow could have merely been a curious pinniped, a dolphin, or most likely just a shoal of fish. But unfortunately, the shape was none of these things. At 3 p.m., Kirsty screamed and was dragged underwater. The researchers on shore deployed their boat as Kirsty resurfaced and briefly struggled with something before being pulled under again. And at this point, the assailant revealed itself as a leopard seal, Hydrogoleptonyx. By the time the boat arrived, the surface was silent, and Kirsty was gone. Kirsty's dive buddy, equipped with goggles, last saw her 30 feet deep and going deeper, trying to claw her way to the surface. But of course, it was no use. This was the work of a slow Tuesday for leptonics. The average person can hold their breath for 30 to 90 seconds. And of course, that's not while fighting for life. So after 2 minutes of unbroken seas, Kirsty's colleagues were probably losing hope with each passing second, sitting in that boat with nothing to do but wait, knowing full well that time was not on humanity's side in the chilled waters of South Cove. After 6 agonizing minutes, they saw a disturbance on the surface almost a half-mile away. The seal had breached and had something with it, and the researchers made for it. The seal ignored the approaching boat, and when they arrived, what they saw confirmed their fears. Kirsty was face down, being dragged by the head. Her neck was gruesomely angled and elongated from being pulled. After a brief struggle, the team of 3 got her into the boat, and the seal played in the propeller's wake all the way back to shore, perhaps as nothing more than a stark reminder of how little our troubles matter to the natural forces. It would have been a pretty thing to see under different circumstances, and as the seal played, life-saving efforts were employed, but the damage was cumulative. She had no less than 46 distinct and significant wounds, many of which were to the face and neck. She had been underwater for about 6 minutes, and equally as lethal. Her dive computer would later tell that she was taken all the way to the ocean floor, a depth of some 240 feet. Severe complications occur around 100 feet. And divers, with scuba gear, so not just snorkeling, who venture beyond that depth, need to take decompression breaks, and usually have various cocktails of air to breathe. Between the wounds, the time below, and the depth, any one of those factors could have proven fatal, but all 3 were definitive. University of St. Andrews Professor Ian Boyd's inquiry into Miss Brown's death stated that the seal may have mistaken her for a fur seal. And I'll talk more about this in a soon-to-come shark video that isn't ready yet, but this mistaken identity shtick is bad science, in my opinion. Mistaken identity is just like a concept that we cling to because it's more palatable than the alternative, more palatable than the far more obvious, though more disconcerting reality of the matter. The attack lasted 6 minutes. The 2 mammals together traversed some 200 feet in depth and somewhere near a mile in distance. She had sustained almost 50 unique and distinct injuries. Leopard seals are true seals, also known as earless seals, whereas sea lions and fur seals have outer ears and arched backs. True seals, like the leopard seal, have no outer ear and a greater spinal rigidity, and though they don't have outer ears, they have keen hearing, and have around 5 distinct vocalizations, each with a different meaning. These vocalizations are meant to be heard by other leopard seals, and they range from, quote, bird-like trills to haunting moans. Leopard seals also have some of the best vision of all marine mammals, and they have a sense of smell on par with that of bears, which is 10 times greater than that of a bloodhound. I say all this to tell you that the animal that dispatched Miss Brown did not think she was a fur seal. Now please forgive the crassness of this metaphor, but if I eat a hot dog, it's not because I thought it was a brat. It's because I said, I guess I'll try a hot dog. Again, that's more applicable to sharks, because this attack likely wasn't even predatory. This large mesopredator, that is, a predator that answers only to one other, saw Kirsty Brown, and for whatever reason of many, wanted her out of the water, and it knew she wasn't a seal. Oh, and by the way, no part of her was consumed. Biologists should really scrap the mistaken identity thing, in my opinion. Animals are not dumb brutes that see the world as seal or other. That's like saying my homus ripped apart the couch because he thought it was a rawhide. If he thought it was a chewy, then why is his tail between his legs? Saying this particular seal thought Kirsty was a fur seal is unsupported by what we know about leopard seals. It's just not an applicable analogy. It was quite difficult to find exactly what happened to Kirsty. All the online articles are understandably vague, and they all had one thing in common. At least to me, they seem to minimize the culpability of the mesopredator. And I understand why, I do, but still. So to get as accurate an account as I could, I bought the inquest, so everything I said in this video is as accurate as I can be without having been there or without having spoken with someone who was there. Kirsty Brown has an island named after her in the Antarctic waters, and those that were close to her say that she was well aware of the risks, and those risks wouldn't have stopped her from doing what she loved, but I suspect they speak out of turn. The attack was in 2003, and leopard seals have an average life expectancy of 25 years, meaning it's at least possible that the perpetrator is still there. Number 2. It was 8 p.m. on May 19th, 1987, when youthful hijinks turned into something far more devastating, something difficult to imagine. 3 boys, 2 11-year-olds and 1 10-year-old, walked into Prospect Park Zoo in Brooklyn, New York. Many sources say they snuck in, but that's kind of debatable, seeing as the property was only loosely gated. Either way, they snuck in when it was closed, after dark, and these 3 youths had a very youthful plan. That May, New York was in the grip of a record heat wave, much like the record heat waves before and after, and so the boys endeavored to swim with seals, the nice kind. For some reason, they were fixated on swimming with seals, which to me is a plan that's as wholesome as it is disconcerting. But had they stuck to this plan, they very well may have gotten away with an amazing and innocently illicit experience. But plans change, and their plan changed for the worse, because on their way to the seal enclosure, they passed the polar bear exhibit. They saw Teddy, a 1,300-pound male, and a female named Lucy, who weighed a mere 900 pounds. The murderous lumps lay sleeping, halfway inside of an artificial cave, beneath the sodium vapor lights of the dark-deprived cityscape. No one knows why the boys decided to do what they did. Even the survivors today probably don't know why. It has been suggested that it was a dare, or maybe bragging rights. But whatever the reason may be, they scaled the fence that kept visitors at bay, and stood directly before a steep drop-off into the water of the beast's domain. And there they removed their shoes and shorts. Looking down into the black water, and the massive bears beyond, it seems that 2 of the boys got cold feet. About as well-deserved cold feet as I could imagine. But the third, one of the 11-year-olds named Juan Perez, threw all of their clothes into the exhibit, and goaded his friends to join him. Wisely, the 2 boys refused, but Juan tragically kind of forced his own hand in a way, because now he had to retrieve the clothes he threw in. So he snaked around the visitor fence to the 8-foot-tall wrought iron fence that wasn't visible to the public, and he made his way through the bars. And the other 2 boys, nameless here, said that the bears didn't even react to the clothes being thrown in, but were staring at Juan intently as he snaked his way through the bars. And as soon as he landed, Teddy, the 1,300-pound boar, rushed him with that particular look on its face, that particular predatory glint that all predators possess, but with bears is particularly pronounced. Teddy and Lucy came to the zoo in 1965, when they were just little cubs. They had spent their 27 years in this pen, and in the entire time, nothing more than a pigeon or perhaps a thoughtless duck had intruded on their domain, so you can imagine that they were most intrigued. 11-year-old Juan's last words were, "Go get help. He's biting me really hard." And his companions fled. And it seems that the 2 boys didn't know that security was in the zoo that night, so they leave the zoo. Meanwhile, The zoo's night staff call police and paramedics before they even know exactly what's happening, which, sadly should give you a sense of the kind of noises that poor Juan was making. And after they call the authorities, they follow the screams to the polar bear exhibit, and they see the boy being tossed around, and his exact condition is unclear at this time. But surprisingly, police show up in less than 5 minutes, and by the time they arrived, Juan's condition was obvious. He was entirely consumed from the belly down, and Lucy and Teddy were playing tug-of-war with the shoulders and chest. Obviously, nothing could be done. In what, to me, seemed to be a rather enlightened move by the police and zoo executives, especially in the 80s, they actually decided not to kill the bears, seeing as the bears didn't do anything wrong, per se. Had Juan still been alive, I'm sure it would have been a different matter. But then they noticed that there were 3 pairs of shorts and 5 shoes in the bear enclosure. And because of the rocks and the nooks and hidey holes in the bear habitat, they worried that other boys might be hiding somewhere, desperate not to draw attention to themselves, or wounded or in shock. So the police and zoo staff made the decision to terminate the bears. A total of 20 slugs from a single 12-gauge shotgun laid Teddy and Lucy low, as well as 6 .38 special rounds, which makes me feel like someone just wanted to be part of it. I don't know. They just kept shooting until they were dead. And if it took 20 slugs, then it must have been a pretty agonizing minute or so. And I find this super depressing, but before the shooting began, the zookeepers shut the gate between the inside and outside parts of the bear habitat, meaning they had nowhere to run, and were prohibited from dying in their beds. And you know, this is the first and I hope only time you'll hear me express sympathy for man-eaters on my channel. And that's because these bears were in captivity. Every single thing about their existence is 100% the zoo's responsibility. Bringing a bear to New York City doesn't make it any less of a bear. And with these 2 bears dead, cops and staff searched the enclosure and found no one hiding, and could not account for why there was clothing for 3 in the bear enclosure. And as you could imagine, they feared the worst. So they loaded the bears into a truck and brought them to somewhere in the zoo, where an on-call veterinarian waited for a city coroner to observe a necropsy to check the stomach contents. I guess a coroner had to be there to analyze the human remains they may find. And though everyone grimly expected to find the remains of 3 boys, only the lower half of Juan was found, between the 2 bears' stomach contents. Now, the zoo and police response was, in my opinion, impressive to the point of remarkable. The necropsies were already occurring by the time a couple of boys with their parents were walking into the police station, and the boys, whose names were never released, but are findable if you know where to look, gave all the details. And honestly, forgive me for even going here, but I'm not exactly sure how much I even believed the story they told. All blame went to the participant who couldn't give his take on the matter, as they said it was Juan who threw their clothes in, and then went in on his own, as they were telling him it was a bad idea. I don't know. I could see it being almost the opposite of that, but it's also very possible that that's exactly what happened. Regardless, they were only 10 and 11 at the time, and I obviously don't wish them any grief. At this point in 1987, Prospect Park Zoo was known for being one of the worst zoos in the country. I did some sleuthing, and the atrocities ranged from, quote, training capuchin monkeys with scalding water to beating ungulates with clubs, and feeding some animals to others for budgetary reasons. The zoo closed after this incident, and remained that way for 6 years, reopening in 1993 under entirely new management. I used to work at a zoo, and I used to think highly of zoos, and they do a lot of good. You know, fundraising and spotlighting conservation issues, education, all that jazz. But the older I get, the less merit I see in them. I know a lot of the animals in zoos wouldn't be alive otherwise, but there's just no way that a pen of a certain square footage can replicate the nuance of any environment, and all the fun little trinkets, colorful backgrounds, and tasty treats fail to obscure that fact. This just isn't right to me anymore. And this is just all sorts of wrong. All kinds of wrong. Many, many manners of wrong. And I'm not even accusing the parents of anything. The baby's not in danger. It's just a gut thing. The tragedy that unfolded here in the spring of 1987 is precisely what happens when naivety and reality climax. But at least it was a much quicker ordeal than our next attack. It was October 14th, 1972, off the north shore of Kane Bay, in the Virgin Islands. 3 scuba divers were collecting samples, photos, and the contents of a fish trap for research purposes. These divers were hired hands, so to speak, It turns out that a lot of marine biologists don't care for deep water diving, so they would hire people like Rod, Brett, and Robbie. The 3 divers would be descending to a depth of 220 feet, and they were double tanked and decked out with the most modern equipment that 1972 had to offer. There was no boat. They entered the water from the beach. They swam on the surface for 300 yards, and then began their descent into a nightmare. But like the worst of nightmares, it didn't start that way. They had made this dive over 100 times in the past 2 years, both for work and for fun, and this dive was unremarkable at first. There was one thing, though. At about 180 feet down, they saw 2 fish, sharks, patrolling by. Brett Gilliam said they were oceanic whitetips, and he said that one was 12 feet and the other was 14 feet in length. Brett was a relatively noob diver in 1972, and he said you simply can't find whitetips that big anymore. And I'll get more into this later, but of all the sharks in the world, the whitetip is the species that you least want to encounter. Anyway, 2 whitetips, a 12 and a 14-footer, patrol right past the divers, within 10 feet, and because divers of this nature have unimaginably big balls of courage, they were not the least bit concerned. The only thing they noted was that it was curious to see these sharks so close to shore, because remember, the divers swam from the beach. They were only 300 yards from dry land. All 3 of them had dealt with aggressive whitetips before, and Brett would later say that as long as you don't turn your back to them, you're fine. Usually, that is. He also said that whitetips tend to work themselves up to aggression. They're not like tiger sharks, which will typically come out of nowhere and take as much as they can as fast as they can. And he also noted that these 2 particular whitetips seemed as docile as could be. They just cruised by. So the divers go about collecting their specimens, taking their photos, and checking the traps for the biologists' surveys, and all was well. And once their tasks were completed, Robbie and Brett met at the rendezvous point to begin their ascent, but the 3rd diver, Rod, was late. Now remember, this was the 70s, and everything was manual. Today, dive equipment has all sorts of beeps and chimes to tell you stuff, but in 1972, everything was just gauges that you couldn't really check yourself. So Brett checks Robbie's meters, and he's low on air, factoring in decompression breaks, of course. And as Brett is checking Robbie's gauges, Robbie points toward Rod, who is by a drop-off. And there's a lot of silt in the water, and there's a lot of bubbles coming up. But since Robbie's air was low, Brett signals for him to go up, and Brett will go help Rod with whatever issue he's having. Mind you, at that time, Brett assumed that the issue was a valve or some other elementary thing, but of course he was wrong. Upon approaching, Brett saw that things were much worse than he imagined. Blood gushed from Rod's thigh like a green cloud. Yeah, blood appears green in deep water, without sunlight. The next thing Brett noticed was that in the silt cloud, next to Rod, there was a shark latched onto Rod's thigh, trying, with some success, to pull Rod over a drop-off and into deeper water. And this is out of the bull shark's playbook. They're the ones known for dragging victims into deeper water. And they were on kind of a rocky, corally ledge, and had poor Rod not had things to grab onto, it's very possible he simply would have been carried off into the abyss, and his friends would never have known his fate. Now, before he passed away of natural causes in 2023, Brett Gilliam was not only the kind of man you wanted to be with on a dive, but he was also the kind of man you wanted to be. He was a writer, entrepreneur, deep-sea diver, and multimillionaire. I listened to several podcasts that he was on, and he was an impressive man. And he was funny. Like, actually funny. But unfortunately, not much of that humor will shine through here. So Brett grabs Rod by the shoulder harness and starts pulling him away from the black chasm, and Rod is kicking the beast with his free leg. And it's chilling to think how this single shark, even the 12-footer, was about the same length and weight as the 2 men. When out of nowhere, the second shark, the 14-footer, corkscrews in and bites the same leg as the first shark, and Rod ferociously punches at it. But now his formerly free leg is pinned by the writhing bodies, is trying his best to punch and kick at them too, but it was like punching a wall. The larger of the 2 sharks was not merely playing tug-of-war, it was actively eating. Now I have to tell you this. I have a video about misconceptions about sharks coming, and it's surprising how few shark attacks involve consumption. Most shark attacks, believe it or not, are not an attempt to consume, which seems counterintuitive, but it's true. Because here's the thing, there's really no difference between the attack and the consuming. A shark attack is the consuming. But these sharks had consumption on their mind. By this point, Rod's leg was missing a great deal of flesh, partially denuded, stripped of flesh 200 feet from sunlight. The two men desperately struck at the larger and closer shark's eyes and gills, and abruptly, it left, causing its slightly smaller companion to do the same. Looking up, Brett saw the other diver, Robbie, decompressing 100 feet above, looking down in horror. As all heroes know, it's now or never. Brett, with his wounded friend in one arm, kicked for the surface as he'd never kicked before. Rod was limp, but still holding his friend with his own strength. They made it less than 30 seconds before the sharks came back. And likely, this is why the cunning predators had left, and why they were trying to pull them off the drop-off in the beginning. Humans are much more manageable without the ocean floor for leverage. We're far more vulnerable, suspended in open water, and you better believe that sharks are smart enough to understand that. But this time, consumption wasn't on their mind so much as securing their prey, and the two sharks towed the two men over the drop-off with the obvious intention of taking them to the void, and Brett's swim fins were no match for twin caudal. The sharks were taking turns now. One hauling, and the other tearing and shaking. One tearing and shaking, and the other hauling, working their way to the drop-off. Brett saw Rod take a single swing at one of the sharks, and he said that it was a sad surprise that he was still alive. There was an outcropping of coral along the rim of the drop-off, and Brett grabbed it, and it offered enough leverage for his blows to hurt, and the sharks left again. But they didn't go far this time, they just circled. They knew their prey had nowhere to go. Merely 10 feet away they circled, and while Brett had his eyes on one, like lightning, the other swallowed what remained of Rod's leg, and Brett tried to force him deeper into the coral for cover, but there was no gap large enough. This maneuver was the first time since the attack began that Brett and Rod came face to face, and Rod shook his head and weakly pushed Brett away, which of course was Rod's way of saying, "I'm finished, save yourself." And you have to keep in mind that from his perspective, even if by some miracle the sharks just left, he'd still have to ascend 300 feet, with no time for decompression breaks, then get to shore, and then get from that desolate beach to a hospital. It was probably a long time before then that he realized that there was only one way for his story to end. But Brett refused, and went to grab Rod's front waist harness, but the harness was gone. And it was at that point that Brett noticed that Rod had been disemboweled. Brett said he roared into his mouthpiece and slung Rod over his shoulder, and began to swim for the surface, perhaps, if for no other reason than to not let his friend spend the rest of time down there. But he only made it a few kicks before the sharks were back on Rod, and with a couple of devastating shakes, Rod uttered his final scream, and there wasn't much to hold on to anymore, and it had ended around 350 feet. And as Brett kicked to the surface, he saw the beasts ferrying Rod over the ledge. His body twitched and spasmed as muscle and tendon responded to tug and slack. And that's when Brett ran out of air. He would later write, quote, "I almost decided to stay there and die," and he said it was entirely indescribable, the feeling of sheer adrenaline coupling with a lack of oxygen. And I think that's a good representation of the quote, when an unstoppable object meets an unmovable force. Though as always, there will be a decisive victor in the end. The last thing he thought before he passed out was, "Damn, I almost made it." Fortunately, he woke up at the surface, and it was a matter of science that saved his life. The air in his dive vest had been enough to propel him up. Air expands at higher elevation, and the air in his lungs literally got bigger and forced its way out as he rose, meaning the changing in air pressure caused him to take an involuntary breath as he belched the expanding air and inhaled new air. Robbie, the third diver, was nowhere to be seen, which made sense, because he had no idea how far his submarine ordeal had taken him. Brett made it to shore, where two beachgoers approached. He spoke quickly, because he knew decompression sickness made his conscious time short. He told the beachgoers, quote, "I'm a professional diver. I have decompression sickness. That's my truck right there. My keys are on the left front tire." And then he passed out. And this is yet another instance in this saga that Brett cheated death. These two beachgoers, husband and wife, also happened to be doctor and nurse. And Brett was medvac to Puerto Rico, where he obviously recovered. And about the people who rescued him, doctor and nurse, I swear that miracles abound in the shark attack world. Of course, so does tragedy, but I guess one is impossible without the other. And I'll talk on this more in my shark video, but there was a vicious shark attack. Tiger shark, I believe. And this woman was snorkeling, and she got ripped apart. And it turns out that the boat that pulled her up happened to be like a retreat for some special rank of trauma doctors. It was something like that. But imagine getting mangled in the middle of the ocean, only to be among a group of the most qualified surgeons from your part of the continent, all by chance. Researching shark attacks always highlights how dangerously, and in my opinion, inexcusably underprepared these little snorkeling adventure gigs in the Caribbean or anywhere else are. Someone literally loses a leg and 60% of their glutes, and the captain's like, I have a towel, it's kinda clean. Obviously having a medic on board is too much to ask for some reason, but if you're taking people into water that is literally teeming with tigers and bulls, at least having a tourniquet that you know how to use seems like a good idea. Anyhow, earlier I mentioned that oceanic whitetips are probably the worst shark to run into, which is curious because they're not the most threatening. They're not the biggest at all. In fact, they might even be the smallest of the sharks that pose a threat to humans. I spent a ridiculous amount of time on this graphic, considering how rinky-dink it looks. But this is a pretty darn well-scaled graphic of exceptionally large sharks of 4 species. The man's shoulders are 45 centimeters, or 1.47 feet in width. You're looking at the jaws of a 10 or 12-foot oceanic whitetip, in the bottom right, a 10 or 12-foot bull shark, which are considerably more girthy than whitetips, a 15 or 16-foot tiger, and a great white shark that is about 20 feet in length. Now, keep in mind, these aren't even record sharks. These are just about as large as is typical for large. And as a note, great whites live a lot longer than they grow. It seems that they max out at about 21.5 feet, and then they just get fatter, not longer. And yes, there are a handful of well-documented cases of people being swallowed whole by white sharks. And I've spent a great deal of time pondering how long a person lingers in there. I believe the only other shark that poses a significant risk to people, other than these 4, is the mako. Both longfin and shortfin makos grow over 10 feet. They say the longfin is more dangerous because it's more aggressive, but the shortfin is bigger, so it's a toss-up between the two as far as I can tell. Ugh. Maybe even the nastiest shark attack of all time was a mako shark. It was in Egypt in 2015, in the Red Sea. Egypt doesn't release locations or names as to not hurt the tourism industry, or single a certain place out, but it was a 52-year-old German tourist, a male. He was swimming just 30 feet from shore when a mako got a hold of him and started consuming, which as I've said is kind of rare. And a guy in a Zodiac, or a little boat, saw it happen, and he raced over to help the guy, and by the time he got to the victim, the mako had dragged him over 300 feet from shore, and a tug-of-war ensued. And the Good Samaritan got him in the boat, but the mako got to keep a leg, so you can picture how that went. Just imagine seeing the shore getting farther and farther away. He died shortly after he was out of the water. It was just too much damage. But this has to be one of the nastiest attacks just because of how long it lasted, and it's because of the mako's teeth. These are for holding, not for slicing. Yeah, so this isn't like being sliced by razors, like a tiger shark. This is just like being gripped by ice picks and being shaken to death. And this is why I just won't go in the water. I've gotten pretty good at letting comments roll off my back by now, but one exchange that got me a little while ago was in response to when I said in a video that I won't go into the water. And someone was like, I feel so bad for you. You're letting fear dictate your life. You'll never know what you're missing, blah, 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 blah. And first of all, I live in Wisconsin, so fearing the ocean would be a little different if I was Moana. But 2, I don't care how gratifying the ocean is. There's no swim or octopus experience that's worth being towed 300 meters and being shaken to death by a fish. At least a bear, you see it coming. You can breathe while it's happening. You know where it is. So we got the white, the tiger, the bull, the white tip, the makos. Oh, also the bronzy. There have been a few fatalities with the bronze whaler, though I often wonder if they are involved in more attacks, but are simply misidentified as bull sharks. Also the giant hammerhead. Anything that big is a threat, and there have been a number of bites, usually on divers, and that's territorial. But I don't think there have been any confirmed fatalities of a hammerhead shark on a person. And then, of course, you have your spinners and blues and reef sharks and sand tigers, sandbar sharks. And those are actually very likely to bite you, but they are very rarely fatal. And if they are, it's usually because you couldn't get access to help for whatever reason. They certainly might take a piece out of you. They just don't have the temperament or ability to consume you, so long as you're able to get out of the water, of course. They call Florida the shark attack capital of the world, but that's just not true. It's the shark bite capital of the world. Statistically speaking, if you're going to get bit by a shark anywhere in the world, you by far want it to be in Florida, because the overwhelming majority of, quote, attacks in Florida are just a matter of getting a few stitches. Anyway, back to whitetips. Mouth size is a huge factor in the threat of sharks, and whitetips just don't really have it. Granted, they're a little larger than blacktip, but fairly similarly sized. And the blacktip isn't responsible for any fatalities that I'm aware of. Lots of stitches, but nothing substantial. So why, of all the ferocious bulls and stealthy tigers and massive whites, is the little whitetip the most feared? Well, because if you encounter one, you ain't on the beach. You're far from help. That's why. Whitetips are open water nomads. And usually, the only people in open water are people who really don't want to be there. Somewhere far from help. The reason these attack videos are important to me is because I'm legitimately horrified by a lot of social media users' views on animals, particularly animals like sharks. I love these creatures too. But no, these animals are absolutely not more afraid of you than you are of them. And if you aren't afraid of them, there's something wrong with either your attitude or your brain. And at least Grizzly Man lived his delusion. Like when he said he's in no danger, or when he said they'd never hurt him. At least he had some credibility because he pulled it off for so long. And it was this dumb, and I'm not even saying he's dumb, but it was dumb confidence that helped him get away with it for so long. But like this Ocean Ramsey character, you may have seen some of her videos. She's going to get someone killed. She says she's a published marine biologist, but no evidence can be found to support that claim. And not only is she going to get someone killed, but all the people that have been killed since she started making those videos. Obviously, it's not her fault, but I'm sure they tried to redirect the shark, and it didn't work. And she says, redirect the shark, that's what she always says. This is not advice. Everyone who's ever been killed by a tiger shark probably tried their damnedest to redirect the shark. Brett and Rod tried to redirect the sharks, and it's nonsense. And I can't help but notice that all of her sharks have something in common. They are fat. Fat sharks. I have no evidence to support this, it's just my opinion. It's just a guess. But I'd imagine a very fat shark is the shark you least have to worry about. Because a fat shark probably isn't in the mind to eat you. Because I don't think we're particularly appealing to sharks. Because if we were, then we'd be getting eaten all the time, and we're not. I think that a shark has to be a particular kind of hungry, or the opportunity needs to be just right. But not only is a fat shark less likely to eat you, but I think a fat shark is less likely to be territorial. You're obviously not messing up a fat shark's ability to hunt or feed, so what does it care? And probably in general, a fat shark is just less likely to be ornery. Yeah, I don't know if she's making her videos by a whale graveyard or something, but if a giant tiger shark is coming at you, do not expect that you can just redirect it by pushing its snout. That's nuts. That's bonkers. That's just not how large predators operate. Imagine if you could stop a bear attack by pushing its snout. It's just wrong. They didn't get giant by letting prey push them away. Though I guess in her defense, your best option is to maintain direct eye contact. Though if it's looking to feed, there's nothing that's going to stop it. Redirect. Anyway, and as always, thanks an awful lot for listening.